paint doesn't lie, not really. Not if you're patient enough to let it talk. Most people think of paint as the last thing that goes onto a machine, the pretty coat that hides the working parts underneath, decoration and nothing more. I used to think that too, before I spent 3 weeks with a heat gun and a scraper peeling back the skin of a Massey Ferguson that had no business having 40 coats of paint on it, and learned that every single one of those layers was a sentence in a story somebody had been trying very hard to erase. She came to me the way most of my projects come to me now, which is to say, a neighbor 2 farms over called and said his father's old Massey had been sitting behind the machine shed since before he could remember, and did I want it before the scrap man came for it. I drove out on a Tuesday morning with my flatbed trailer and a thermos of coffee that went cold before I even got the winch hooked up, because the moment I laid eyes on that tractor, I stopped thinking about scrap value entirely. She was a mess, don't misunderstand me. Weeds had grown up through the front axle so thick I had to cut them away with loppers before the tires would even turn. But underneath the neglect, underneath 4 decades of Nebraska weather doing its worst, there was something about the shape of her that made me stand there in the wet grass a full 5 minutes before I did a single practical thing. What struck me first wasn't the rust, though there was plenty of that, deep and orange and blistering along every seam where water likes to collect and sit and think about its next move. What struck me was the paint, or rather, the paints, plural, because even standing 6 feet back in the morning light, I could see at least 3 different colors peeking through in different patches, a red showing through where a fender had been chipped, a strange industrial gray along one running board, and underneath both of those, in a spot where a decal had once been and had long since curled away, something that looked almost like a deep forest green, nothing like Massey Ferguson ever painted a tractor in its life. I remember standing there thinking, that's not right, and I didn't mean the color scheme. I meant something deeper than that, some instinct old restorers develop after enough years of reading machinery, like other people read faces. A tractor with 1 coat of paint has a simple history. A tractor with layers has secrets, and this one had more layers than any machine I'd worked on before, and I hadn't even started stripping yet. I want to tell you about my hands before I tell you about the paint, because the two are connected in a way that took me years to understand. I've been doing restoration work since I was in my 30s, when my late husband first put a wire brush in my hand and told me the only way to really know a machine was to clean it yourself, every inch with your own fingers, not a pressure washer, not a sandblaster on the fine work, your own hands doing the noticing that machines can't do for you. My hands are not soft anymore. They haven't been soft in a long time. There's a permanent groove along my right palm from 30 years of gripping a wire wheel, and my knuckles ache when the weather turns the way old iron creaks when the temperature drops. But those hands know things that my eyes miss, and when I ran them across that Massey's hood for the first time, feeling for soft spots, feeling for the telltale of rust-through hiding under a skin of paint, I felt something that made me stop. There were ridges, not damage, not dents, ridges, subtle ones, running in patterns across the hood that didn't match any factory contour I'd ever felt on a Massey Ferguson before. Paint doesn't ridge like that on its own, not from age, not from weather. Paint ridges like that when there's something underneath it that shouldn't be there, or when there are so many layers stacked on top of each other, applied over years by careless or hurried hands, that the buildup itself starts to have its own topography. I'd restored plenty of tractors that had been repainted once, maybe twice, by an owner wanting to freshen things up. I had never in my life felt a hood with what my fingers were telling me might be a dozen coats or more. And once my hands told me that, my mind wouldn't let it go. I needed to know why. I needed to know who kept painting over this tractor, instead of just letting the old paint be, and what they were trying to bury every single time they picked up a brush. The stripping started slow, the way it has to, because heat guns and chemical strippers are unforgiving tools in careless hands, and I've seen too many good restorers warp thin sheet metal by getting impatient with a torch. I worked in sections, hood first, laying a tarp underneath to catch the curls of paint as they came away. And I want you to understand what that process actually looks like, because it's not glamorous, it's not satisfying in the way people imagine. It's slow, it's methodical, it's holding a heat gun 6 inches from a surface until the paint just starts to bubble, just barely, and then working a scraper underneath at exactly the right angle before it cools again, and doing that inch by inch by inch across a surface the size of a small dining table for hours, while your shoulders scream and your eyes water from the fumes, even with the barn doors wide open and a box fan running full blast behind you. The stripping started slow, the way it has to, because heat guns and chemical strippers are unforgiving tools in careless hands. And I've seen too many good restorers warp thin sheet metal by getting impatient with a torch. I worked in sections, hood first, laying a tarp underneath to catch the curls of paint as they came away, and I want you to understand what that process actually looks like, because it's not glamorous. It's not satisfying in the way people imagine. It's slow, it's methodical, it's holding a heat gun 6 inches from a surface until the paint just starts to bubble, just barely, and then working a scraper underneath at exactly the right angle before it cools again, and doing that inch by inch by inch across a surface the size of a small dining table for hours, while your shoulders scream and your eyes water from the fumes, even with the barn doors wide open and a box fan running full blast behind you. My barn, the one I do this work in, still smells like my husband some mornings, or at least I let myself believe it does, 12 years after he passed. It's not a sentimental delusion so much as a fact of chemistry. Decades of the same brands of solvent and the same grade of two-stroke oil soak into wood the way perfume soaks into a scarf. And a barn that's hosted 40 years of one man's careful, patient work holds on to that smell longer than you'd think possible. He built the workbench I still use. He hung the pegboard where every wrench has its own painted outline, so you always know at a glance what's missing. And on days like the ones I spent stripping that Massey down layer by layer, I talk to him a little, the way I imagine every widow who still does the work her husband taught her talks to the empty space beside her. Not out of grief exactly, out of habit. Out of the simple fact that some conversations don't end just because one half of them stopped answering. The top layer came off easy enough, a flat industrial gray, the kind of paint you'd use if you didn't care much about appearances and just wanted rust protection, applied thick and sloppy, with brush strokes visible even after all these years, the mark of someone working fast, maybe someone who didn't even own the tractor, maybe a farmhand told to slap a coat on it before winter. Underneath that gray, the red showed itself properly for the first time, a deep Massey Ferguson red, close to factory original but not quite the right shade, the kind of close but not exact color you get from a farm supply store rather than a dealership. That was layer 2. And I sat back on my heels after clearing a 2-foot patch down to that red, and that's probably close to original. That's probably what she looked like when she rolled off some dealer's lot back in the 50s. I was wrong. I was so wrong, and I didn't know it yet, and that's the particular cruelty and the particular joy of this kind of work. You think you've found the bottom, and the machine just keeps handing you more. Underneath that red, after another full evening of careful, patient scraping, I found gray again. A different gray this time, darker, almost charcoal, applied more carefully than the sloppy top coat, with none of those rushed brush strokes, the kind of paint job someone had taken their time on. And underneath that gray, deeper still, I finally reached the green. That strange forest green I'd glimpsed in that one worn patch the very first morning I laid eyes on her. Except now, stripped bare across the whole hood, it wasn't just a color anymore. It was clearly, unmistakably, a different manufacturer's shade entirely. And there, faint but readable, once I cleaned the grime away with mineral spirits, was the ghost of a decal, the raised outline where letters had once sat under paint that had never quite bonded flush against them. I got down on my knees in that barn with a flashlight and my reading glasses pushed up on my nose, and I read, letter by careful letter, a name that had absolutely no business being on a Massey Ferguson. I'm not going to tell you that name yet, because I didn't understand it myself for another 3 weeks, and I think you deserve to sit with that mystery the same way I had to. What I can tell you is that finding a ghost decal from an entirely different tractor manufacturer buried under 4 separate coats of paint on a machine that was supposed to be, by every serial number and every dealer stamp I could find, a genuine Massey Ferguson from the factory floor, is the kind of thing that makes a restorer put down her tools and go sit on the porch with a cup of coffee for a good long while, turning the puzzle over and over, because pieces like that don't fit together by accident. I called my neighbor, the one who'd sold me the tractor, and I asked him straight out what he knew about his father's history with this machine. He didn't know much, he admitted, because his father wasn't a talker, the same way most of the men of that generation weren't talkers. The kind of men who'd rather rebuild an entire transmission by lantern light than sit down and explain their feelings to their own children. But he did remember one thing. One detail his father had mentioned exactly once, years ago, in passing, the way people mention things they don't want you to ask follow-up questions about. He remembered his father saying that this tractor used to be somebody else's problem before it was mine, and nothing more than that. No context, no explanation, and at the time, as a boy, he hadn't thought to ask what that meant. I sat with that phrase for days while I kept working. Used to be somebody else's problem. I turned it over while I stripped paint off the fenders, finding yet another layer down there, a 5th coat now, this one a plain, rust-red primer that had clearly been meant as a base coat and nothing more. Evidence that whoever painted this tractor the final time hadn't cared about matching factory colors at all, had just wanted the whole thing sealed up and protected. And I began to suspect disguised. Because that's what repeated repainting does to a piece of machinery when it's done carelessly and repeatedly over the years. It doesn't just protect the metal, it obscures the history. Every coat is a small act of forgetting, whether the person applying it means it that way or not. And 5 coats deep, whatever this tractor had been before, whoever it had belonged to, was buried nearly as thoroughly as if it had been sealed behind plywood in a barn stall, the way I've handled other stories before this one. The mechanical work while all this paint archaeology was happening was its own kind of conversation. Massey Ferguson built these tractors tough, built to be repaired by a farmer with basic tools, rather than a factory technician with a diagnostic computer. And there's a particular respect I have for machines engineered that way. Machines that assume the person working on them is capable and patient, rather than helpless without a dealership. I pulled the engine down to the block and found, much like I've found in other neglected machines, that whoever had last serviced her had done careful, competent work right up until the day they simply stopped. The oil had been changed recently before she went into storage. The air filter had been cleaned and oiled. Someone had cared for this tractor properly right up until, quite suddenly, they didn't anymore. And machines remember that kind of abrupt transition the same way people remember the last ordinary day before everything changed. The mechanical work, while all this paint archaeology was happening, was its own kind of conversation. Massey Ferguson built these tractors tough, built to be repaired by a farmer with basic tools rather than a factory technician with a diagnostic computer. And there's a particular respect I have for machines engineered that way. Machines that assume the person working on them is capable and patient rather than helpless without a dealership. I pulled the engine down to the block and found, much like I've found in other neglected machines, that whoever had last serviced her had done careful, competent work right up until the day they simply stopped. The oil had been changed recently before she went into storage. The air filter had been cleaned and oiled. Someone had cared for this tractor properly right up until, quite suddenly, they didn't anymore. And machines remember that kind of abrupt transition the same way people remember the last ordinary day before everything changed. There was another detail I noticed while I had the seat pan pulled for cleaning, one that seems small until you understand what it means. The seat spring assembly showed 2 distinct wear patterns. 2 different pressure points worn into the same steel coil, as though 2 different people of 2 very different builds had sat there for years apiece. And the steering wheel, once I got the grime off it, showed the same story in a different form. The paint on the wheel's underside was worn down to bare metal in a spot low and to the left, exactly where a smaller hand, or perhaps an older arthritic one, would naturally rest while working a clutch pedal on a cold morning. Machines hold on to the shape of the people who ran them far longer than we give them credit for. Long after a person is gone, their grip is still there in the wear pattern, waiting for someone patient enough to notice it and wonder who left it behind. It was the fuel tank that finally cracked the mystery wide open. And I want to walk you through exactly how I found what I found, because the way you discover something matters almost as much as the discovery itself. I drained what remained of the ancient, gummed-up fuel, a process that involves a lot of patience and a lot of rags and a healthy respect for how flammable old varnished gasoline residue actually is, even decades on. With the tank empty, I ran a shop light down through the fill neck to check for internal rust, a habit my late husband drilled into me on every single restoration, because a rotted-out fuel tank will ruin a rebuilt engine faster than almost anything else on a tractor. And down in that tank, caught against the baffle, was a folded piece of oilcloth, sealed shut with what turned out to be candle wax, of all things, pressed flat and hardened over the fuel-soaked decades until it had practically fused into the seam of the tank itself. Getting it out took nearly an hour of careful work with long forceps and more patience than I usually admit to having, because the fuel had made the cloth brittle in places, and I did not want to tear whatever was inside before I even had a chance to see it. When I finally worked it free and laid it out on a clean rag on my workbench, my hands were shaking, and not from the physical effort. There's a specific feeling that comes from holding something a stranger hid on purpose decades ago, meant to be found by exactly no one, or perhaps meant to be found by exactly the right person someday, and you don't know which until you open it. Inside that oilcloth was a folded bill of sale, brittle and browned but still legible, dated more than a decade before this Massey Ferguson's own paperwork claimed she was built, and the tractor named on that bill of sale wasn't a Massey Ferguson at all. It was a different make entirely, the same one whose ghost decal I'd found buried under all those layers of paint, sold by one farmer to another for a sum of money that felt almost insulting, even accounting for inflation. And underneath the price, in handwriting gone shaky with either age or emotion, a single line that explained everything and nothing all at once. Sold on account of what happened, no fault of the machine. I want to tell you plainly that I have never, in all my years of restoration, come across a single sentence that told me so much while explaining so little. Sold on account of what happened. No fault of the machine. Whatever had occurred on that first farm, whatever tragedy or accident or grief had made a man sell a working tractor for next to nothing, he had wanted the record to show explicitly, in his own hand, that the machine itself bore no blame. He wanted whoever found this someday to know that the iron wasn't cursed, wasn't dangerous, wasn't the villain of whatever story had unfolded around it. He wanted the tractor's name cleared, even as he was giving it away. The rest of the puzzle came together slowly, the way these things do, through county records and a conversation with an elderly woman at the Historical Society who remembered vaguely a story her own mother used to tell about a farming accident 2 generations back, and a rebuild that had apparently taken the surviving family's original tractor, damaged and half destroyed, and rebuilt it so thoroughly, with so many salvaged and substituted parts from other machines over the following years, that it had essentially become a different tractor entirely by the time it carried a Massey Ferguson badge with any legitimacy. Every coat of paint I'd stripped away represented another owner, another decade, another attempt to make peace with a machine that carried more history than any single family wanted to hold on to at once. Gray to seal it, red to make it presentable again, gray again when the red started to feel wrong, and finally green, the truest, oldest layer, the one nobody had painted over on purpose, so much as it had simply been the base that every other decision got built on top of. I finished the restoration slower than I usually do, because every layer I uncovered felt like it deserved a moment of respect before I moved past it. I didn't strip her all the way back to bare metal and repaint her factory red, the way a purist collector might have insisted was the only correct approach. Instead, I made a decision that some restorers would call unconventional and I call honest. I left one small patch, no bigger than my palm, on the underside of the fender where nobody but a mechanic on their back with a flashlight would ever see it. Completely unstripped, all 5 layers intact, gray over red over gray over green over ghost decal, a cross-section of every hand that had ever touched this tractor's story. Everything else, I brought back to a clean, proper, honest Massey Ferguson red, because that's what she'd become. That's what she'd earned the right to be called after all these years, regardless of what she'd started out as. The day I finally turned the key, sitting in that rebuilt seat with the smell of fresh paint and hot engine oil mixing in the barn air, I thought about that unnamed farmer from a different generation, writing sold on account of what happened, no fault of the machine, in handwriting shaking with whatever grief he was carrying. And I thought about every owner after him who painted one more coat over the story rather than telling it out loud. And when that engine caught, steady and strong, running better than she probably had in half a century, I understood something I think every restorer eventually understands if she does this work long enough. We don't just fix machines. We give people permission to stop hiding, one layer at a time, until what's underneath is finally strong enough to run in the daylight again.